black Southerners. Very good. So in addition to the 10% allegiance, the Wade-Davis bill also wanted Southern states to establish new constitutions, state constitutions, that stated in the Constitution that they recognized the freedom of all black Southerners. Do you think all these black people automatically just moved to the North? No, many of them, most of them, wanted to stay in the South. That's where they were from. And the Wade-Davis bill wanted to ensure that each state, in order to get back in the Union, would redo their Constitution, and in that Constitution it would state without doubt the freedom of black Southerners, so black Southerners could stay in those black states and remain free. Now remember I told you they were mad because Southerners would get a chance to vote and run for office? Right? That bugged them. So what they put in there as the third thing is, in order for a state to get in, only political power would be given to Southerners that had done what? Remained what? Loyal to the Union. So any Southerner in Georgia who remained loyal to the Union, in other words, let's say we talk about that senator from Georgia I just kind of made up. What if that senator from Georgia stayed in the Senate and did not leave and go down to the South? Well, they felt he should be able to vote and run for office, but those that didn't should not. That's going to be the hanging up point, because when you pass a bill, who has to okay it? The President. So in July of 1864, the Wade-Davis bill passed through Congress by a very small majority. Okay? So in July of 1864, the Wade-Davis bill passed by a very small majority. Now, what did Lincoln do when it came across his desk? Vetoed it. And he vetoed it for two reasons. Two reasons. One should be obvious to you. What is that? More restrictions on states getting into the Union is going to cause what? More problems. What does he want to do? He wants to get these states back. He wants to unify the United States back. And the hang-up's going to be that third thing I told you, where only those that remained loyal to the Union could vote or run for office. He doesn't feel that's going to work. So he vetoed it. He thinks it's going to hinder his opportunity to get Southern states back in the Union. Anybody want to guess what he didn't like about, what else he didn't like about the other part of that, where the states had to put in their constitutions that the black person was free? Attaboy. He didn't think it should be in a state constitution. He thought it needed to be in the national constitution. Very good, Buck. So the President believed that these rigid provisions would restrict him in rebuilding the Union because he needed to get these Southern states in. And he also believed that the abolishment of slavery must be done through an amendment to the federal Constitution, not just through state laws. So Lincoln's making a few what in the North? Enemies. Okay? And he's also got people that are still mad at him in the South, right? So that takes us to our next subtopic, which is the planned kidnapping of President Lincoln. How many of you knew in here that the people that did him in actually were going to try to kidnap him first? And when that plan fell through, then kidnapping turned to assassination. You know that? Anybody know that? Okay. Now, whether or not Lincoln could have won acceptance for his plan in the South would be never answered. He had made very many enemies after the Civil War, both on the North and the Southern side, like I mentioned. And actually, if you talk to historians, he might have been one of the most hated men in American history at the time. Okay? He was taking heat from the North. He was taking heat from the South. Now, 2 days after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, we have those? 2 days after that,
You want to run down to the guidance officer, grab a box?
2 days after the surrender of Lee at Appomattox, Lincoln addressed a crowd outside of the White House. Okay? 2 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, President Lincoln addressed a large crowd outside of the White House. Well, one man in the audience listening to Lincoln that day was John Wilkes Booth, who was a Southern sympathizer, and he hated everything that President Lincoln stood for. And John Wilkes Booth was outside the White House, one of the spectators, 2 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, when Lincoln addressed a large crowd outside the White House. Booth hated Lincoln. He blamed him for all of the South's ills. He wanted revenge. He didn't like him at all. So in the late summer of 1864, Booth began to develop a plan to kidnap Lincoln. In the late summer of 1864, Booth began developing a plan to kidnap Lincoln. And the plan was he was going to take President Lincoln to Richmond, and he was going to hold him, and what was he going to trade him for? When you kidnap somebody, you're trading him for something. What's he going to trade him for?
Money.
What do you think? Say it? Kind of. He was going to trade it for Confederate prisoners of war. We still had Confederates in places like Elmira, where Luke Geyser went, that had not been released. And it was Booth's plan to kidnap Lincoln, take him to Richmond, Virginia, and offer to give him back in exchange for Confederate prisoners of war. Now, he couldn't do this by himself, so by January of 1865, he had organized a group of co-conspirators. And we're going to talk about all these people because they all have a role in what turns out to be the assassination of President Kennedy. Okay? A lot of people think that Booth did all this on his own. He did not do it on, did I say Kennedy?
Yeah.
Lincoln, sorry. We get to these assassinations. Anyway, so by January of 1865, Booth had organized a group of co-conspirators. Here's who they were. First one was John Surratt Jr. All on your ID sheet. John Surratt Jr. Now, he was a Confederate courier during the war. What's a courier? Somebody delivers messages. Okay? And that's what he did. And Booth made him kind of his second in command in this kidnapping plot. He was his right-hand man. John Surratt Jr. is going to be kind of his right-hand man. And he was a Confederate courier during the Civil War. Another guy that he enlisted help from was Samuel Arnold. Samuel Arnold. And he was simply a boyhood friend of Booth, who also served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Samuel Arnold, a boyhood friend of Booth, who served in the Confederate Army. Also, his co-conspirator was Michael O'Laughlin. Michael O'Laughlin, who was exactly the same as Arnold, a boyhood friend and a man that served in the Confederate Army. Michael O'Laughlin. Another man that he included was George Atzerodt. George Atzerodt. And he was a Confederate blockade runner during the war. What's a Confederate blockade runner? You saw one in the movie. Guy smuggles. The one you saw in the movie was smuggling goods and medicines into Vicksburg during the siege. Well, Atzerodt did the same thing. He was a smuggler, a blockade runner also, and was running goods to different places that needed them during the war. The next person that helped was David Herold. And they described him as a half-witted pharmacy clerk. Half-witted pharmacy clerk. Half-witted pharmacy clerk. Also a co-conspirator was Edmund Spangler. Edmund Spangler. He was a carpenter and a stagehand at Ford's Theater. Surratt, what's a stagehand?
Usually backstage crew, they kind of help out with stuff.
Yeah, put up your, what do you call them? Sets and those types of things, you know, pull the curtains, help people get on and off. Well, that was Edmund Spangler. He was a carpenter and a stagehand. So what do you think he did a lot of at Ford's Theater? Fix things, you know, or build things, okay? Another conspirator was Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne. So I don't want you to get confused. We're going to say Powell from this point on, but he also went as Lewis Payne as well. That's why you see Payne in parentheses. But we'll just go with Lewis Powell during the course of this lecture. And Lewis Powell, or Lewis Payne, was a Confederate soldier who was trained in guerrilla tactics. You know what guerrilla tactics are? It's not gorilla, it's... I might have spelled it wrong just a second. Nope. What are guerrilla tactics?
Behind rocks.
That's right. Guerrilla tactics are the story of a little guy fighting a big guy, and the big guy is going to try to get at the guy and get a hold of him, and the little guy is going to stand back and pop him in the nose about 7 times and then back up. And the guy's going to come at him, he's going to get out of the way, and he's going to pop him in the nose about 7 times. You're not on the offensive so much when you're a guerrilla person's come and hit and run, come and hit you, and then hide. Okay? And it's not what you should do in wartime. You're supposed to stand fast. So he was trained in guerrilla tactics. Lewis Powell as a Confederate soldier. There were 2 other Southern sympathizers that became co-conspirators, unfortunately for them, and when you'll understand when you hear the story. And one was Dr. Samuel Mudd, and the other was Mary Surratt. Dr. Samuel Mudd and Mary Surratt. And for her part, I'm giving you a preview. For Mary Surratt's part in this kidnapping, gone assassination plot, she will become the first woman in American history to be hanged. Okay? And we'll talk about that. Okay? You tell me if you think it was justified. Because they came out with a movie just 2 years ago called The Lincoln Conspiracy that's all about her and her trial and whether she should have been hung. Okay? Now, Booth began this plot, this plan to kidnap Lincoln, and he used this tavern and a boarding house that was operated by Mrs. Surratt. And that's where his group met. And that's what tied Mrs. Surratt into this thing as a co-conspirator. Is Booth and his group used her tavern and her boarding home that she was running to meet to devise this plan. And she had a tavern in Virginia, which was one she leased or rented, and she simply ran the boarding house, didn't own it, ran it in Washington, D.C. So Booth and these co-conspirators would meet both at her tavern in Virginia and in her boarding house in Washington, D.C., and that's where they devised this kidnapping plan of the president. And this is why she got tied in. Now on March 17, 1865, March 17, 1865, the plan came to be. Booth and his co-conspirators had planned to capture President Lincoln while he ironically attended a play on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Not the play that led to his assassination, but he liked to go to plays. He loved plays. And so they got word on March 17 of 1865 that Lincoln was going to be at this theater play, and their plan was to kidnap him during that performance. Well, why didn't it happen? Simply.
He was heavily guarded.
No, he didn't go. He changed his plan, and instead he gave a speech at a local hotel. So he didn't show. Okay? So the reason the kidnapping didn't happen is because Lincoln changed his plan to attend the play performance. Instead he gave a speech at a local hotel. So Booth is mad, right? And what happens between now and the assassination? Lee surrenders, which makes him even madder, right?
Wait, I thought you said
No, I got you, I messed up. Booth's kidnapping plan failed, and Booth was mad because after Lee's surrender, his plan went from what to what? Kidnapping to assassination, okay? Sorry, I screwed that up. So because of Lee's surrender at Appomattox and the fact that this kidnapping plot went to pot, Booth became angry and his plan went from kidnapping to assassination. And that'll take us to this subtopic, the assassination of President Lincoln, which happened 151 years ago today.
Did you just say it was like April 16th?
It- I don't think so.
March
March 17th, yeah. All right, on the evening of April 14th, 1865, President and Mrs. Lincoln decided they would attend a theater performance at Ford's Theater. Okay? On April 14th, 1865, President and Mrs. Lincoln had decided to attend a theater performance at Ford's Theater. And they had invited 14 guests to come with them. They invited 14 guests to come with them. So on April 14th, 1865, President and Mrs. Lincoln decided that they're going to take in a play performance at Ford's Theater and invited 14 guests. The theater performance was entitled Our American Cousin. Well, among the 14 guests that were invited were General Grant and his wife, Julia. Okay? So they were among the 14 guests that were invited. Now it's kind of interesting because according to historians, early that day, Lincoln stated to one of his aides, quote, "I believe there are men who want to take my life, and I have no doubt they will do it." He knew he was hated. And ironically, he stated that to one of his aides that morning. "I believe there are men who want to take my life, and I have no doubt they will do it." Well, unfortunately, all of the guests that Lincoln invited, including General Grant, canceled. Grant was leaving town with his family, and the rest canceled. So only one person joined Lincoln that night from the military, and that was Officer Major Henry Rathbone, who took his fiancée, Clara Harris. So of these 14 guests, the only one that could attend was Henry Rathbone, who was a major in the Union Army, and he also took his fiancée, Clara Harris. They kept their invitation and joined the president. So I worded that a little wrong. Of the 14 people invited, only 2 came. Major Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Well, let's go back to that morning, about 10:30 in the morning on April 14th, 1865. Booth goes to Ford's Theater, and he went there to check his mail, which he had delivered there daily. That's where he got his mail. So Booth, at 10:30 in the morning on the 14th, goes to Ford's Theater, where he acted many times, so he was very familiar there, obviously, and he went there to check his mail. Okay, that's where he had his mail delivered. And when he was there checking his mail, he ran into the manager of Ford's Theater, a guy by the name of Henry Clay Ford. So while he was checking his mail at Ford's Theater that morning, John Wilkes Booth runs into the theater manager, Henry Clay Ford. And what do you think Henry Clay Ford just very innocently tells Booth? The president's coming for the play tonight. He was all excited. Okay, so Ford informed Booth that the president would be attending the play. He was expressing his pleasure in that. He was glad always to have the president come. Is it good PR to have the president come to your place of business? Certainly it is. So Henry Clay Ford was telling Booth about the president's appearance, and Booth began to think, holy smokes, this will be a perfect place for me to get close enough to assassinate him, because is anybody gonna hassle him about being there? Is he gonna have pretty much full access to any place in the theater? This isn't like it is today with the Secret Service. The president is very unprotected at this point, okay? So Booth's thinking, wow, because I'm so well known here as an actor, I'll have full access to the theater. This will be the perfect place to assassinate the president. Now, what a lot of people don't know is this assassination plot that was planned by Booth did not only include President Lincoln. I don't know how many people knew that. There were two other targets that night by this group of co-conspirators. Who might they be? No, that's a good guess. And Grant, that's great, Kyle, because historians say if Grant would not have left town and accepted Lincoln's invitation that night, he certainly may have been a target. That's a great guess. Who else? No. Who else in the government might they want to get at? Who are the important people in the government? Vice President Andrew Johnson was a target. And what's the most powerful position you think in a president's cabinet for the most part? Secretary of State William Seward. So Lincoln wasn't the only target that night. Both Secretary of State William Seward and Vice President Johnson would be targeted for assassination that evening. Now Booth planned these all to happen at the same time because he didn't want word to get out about one that would stop the other. So he had this thing all planned out with his co-conspirators. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Now, did Lincoln have protection? That night he did, but it wasn't like the Secret Service. You're okay. It wasn't like the Secret Service